We're obviously running slightly late. By the way, I'm standing in for Daniel, who, some of you will know, has not been well, very sadly, has been indisposed and can't lead this session or chair this session. So I'm standing in for Daniel. Just on the timing, we are a little bit late. We're hoping to sort of wrap up by 1 o'clock for everything. But of course, there's lunch comes after, and there's a chance for you to sort of carry on conversations. So if it feels slightly abrupt that we end at 1 o'clock, there's, the lunch period is there for you. Still waiting for Alfonso to return. There we go. Okay, so welcome back everyone to this session on Robert Bresson and Notes on Cinematography, which I'm sure most of you, or all of you know, was the book that he published, and in a sense is perhaps part of his rebranding that we were talking about yesterday, this attempt to sort of see himself as a great thinker on cinema. So he produced that book, and that book, of course, has become famous, and many of you will have copies of it in your bags or on your bookshelves. Slim volume, as they say, a slim volume. Anyway, so we have Alfonso and Jonathan to lead this session. Let me remind you about Alfonso. I'm sure you've already had a chance to talk to him and know something about him, but Alfonso is a postdoctoral researcher on the aesthetics and theory of the arts program at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. He studied philosophy at Seville, at the University of at the Pompeu Fabra, forgive me if I got that wrong, University. He's currently completing his doctoral thesis under a university teacher training contract, teaching classes along the way in aesthetics and philosophy of image and cinema of the UAB. His doctoral thesis focuses on the aesthetic and phenomenological review of the French filmmaker Robert Bresson's concept of the model. So, Alfonso.
Thank you very much for the presentation. So in this following presentation, I will mostly intend to clarify some concepts in Robert Bresson. I will focus fundamentally on the notes on the cinematograph and the notions, especially of nature, and through it to the notion of truth, which I think is closely related in Bresson. Both notions are central to understand one of the main concepts in the poetics of Robert Bresson that I work, as he mentioned. That is the concept of the model. An aspect that is in common in both concepts, nature and truth, is the intrinsically elusive character that Bresson possesses when defining them. Although both seems to constitute an essential pivot in his poetics, Bresson resists defining them clearly. For example, regarding nature, the only hint of definition in the notes of cinematographer is a negative one. He said nature, and it looks like a hint of a definition, but he just said, where the dramatic art suppresses in favor of a naturalness that is learned and maintained by exercises. It doesn't say what is nature, it says what it is not. Just say that. And for example, not in notes on cinematography, but it, in an interview by the time of Oasal Baltazar, he says, he also refers to the concept of nature. He said, what is natural in theater is something that is learned and is supported by studied feeling, the same thing that he criticized in the notes. And then when he defines nature, he says, nature is nature. La nature, c'est la nature. She's what we must handle, she's a raw material. But he doesn't define it. He just used tautology. Nature is nature, la nature, c'est la nature. He doesn't define it. He never defined it. So the notion is ambiguous, especially if we consider that when it refers to nature, directly or indirectly, I think he's referring to two senses of nature. We can think about the natural, we could think about the natural things like a stone or like a tree. That, for example, in a aphorism of Robertson, he refers when he says, from the beings and things of nature, wash clean of all art, and especially of the art of drama, you will make an art. Here is referring to natural in the sense that something that doesn't have an explicit spirituality, something completely devoid of intention. But the human being then, as nature, is the human being as one more physical object, among others. That is the model. The models then, in this sense of being a natural thing, is like related to the natural objects, like a tree, like something that is devoid of an intentionality, something that is what it is, just that, without any doubling in itself. But also he has another sense of nature. For example, in this aphorism, when he said, X is imitating Napoleon, whose nature was not to imitate. Here, nature means like the substance of something, the substance of the person, its essence, in the sense of Aristotle, when he says the first substance of something, that which gives meaning to the thing, the inner principle of something. So when he means to nature, he's referring to all the time, he's confusing these two terms of nature. Then the notion of truth is equally elusive in Bresson. Besides considering himself a maniac of truth, is also a confusing term. In this notion, we find a similar dialectics to the one we find with nature. At times, it seems that the truth is linked to the real, that is, with the capture of elements of a completely raw nature, without this going through the filter of intentionality or spiritualization, aspects on which Bresson seems to frequently insist when he presses the virtues of the camera and the tape recorder. And here are some examples. When he says, what no human being is capable of catching, no pencil, brush, pen of pinning down, your camera catches without knowing what it is and pins it down with a machine's scrupulous indifference. Sorry. Or for example, when we say that photography is descriptive, neat image conceived to confined to description, and there are some other examples that I'm not going to read for matters of time. Nature then and truth face two tensions between what we can understand, it's the empirical capture of a given reality without spiritual aggregates. The model should aspire to be like any natural objects in the sense of Cézanne's, like I said, equality of all things, Cézanne painting with the same eye and the same soul, a fruit dish, his son, the Montagne Chamicard, this equality of something that doesn't have an spirituality inner principle in itself. Humble as a tree or a mountain, oblivious to all the spirituality with its intrinsic doubling, original as a sprout of grass. In the same way, this nature will fit with this concept of the real, as I mentioned, since the photographic reality is merely the photographic capture of a given reality without the need to go through any spiritual filter, as it was fundamentally developed by Siegfried Kracauer in his different works on photography and cinema. Now, the natural and the real, in this sense, remain at the level of the empirical. That's my thesis. On the verification of a given object of an artistic or semiotic neutrality that ultimately result in a working method. Bresson already points out, for me, realism is not an end, but a means, he will say. Both natural and real link us with the lack of will of the model and the lack of will of the camera, respectively. That is to say, with an innocent, virgin, naive material. However, this complete exteriority, this absolute simplicity, is still neither nature, in capital letters, nor truth. These tensions are especially glimpsed when the issue of editing, artistic creation, and storytelling come into play. Counterintuitively, these images of reality and raw nature are considered merely as dead images. He says, cutting passage of dead images to living images, everything blossom fresh. What, according to previous readings, could have been understood as a realistic aesthetic along the lines of André Bazin or Siegfried Kracauer is modified and reminds us of a constructivist aesthetic along the lines of Eisenstein or Pudovkin. The dialectics between the real and editing will, however, be equivalent to that of the two senses of nature and that of reality and truth. Regarding this distinction, Bresson is explicit. The crude real will not by itself yield truth, or, to be scrupulous, reject everything about the real that does not become true, the dreadful reality of the false. There's always this dialectic between truth and reality. Then, truth cannot be merely limited to a merely objective empiricist aspect, as could be a type of cinema that is too confident in the virtues of the camera. Although the camera puts us in contact with an important aspect of the truth, a raw and naive material devoid of intentionality, and therefore the possibility of lying. This must, however, be experienced. It must be experience for someone. That is to say, to generate a specific object. A specific affect. That's what we can understand when he points out that one recognizes the truth by its efficacy, by its power. Truth is not just something that it's out there, it's an effect, it's a phenomenological feeling. That's truth. What is idiosyncratic about truth is no longer, as we can see, a reference to an external reality that could be verified, in the sense that we were talking yesterday with Robert Pippin, but rather to a phenomenological effect. He's clear about this when he states, and this is one of the main, the principal quotes, the truth is not encrusted in the living person and real objects you use, then truth is not reality. It's an air of truth. That's why I'm interested. An air of truth, a feeling of truth. We could discuss about that later. That the images take on when you set them together in a certain order. That's true. Therefore, an air of truth that is not simply captured by the camera, but is built by creation. Therefore, the truth is not something that is out there, but is constructed by the author in relation to reality. The truth requires a metamorphosis of the real, passed through the filter of creation. That's what BRESSON will say, like, get things away from habit, declare for them. In this sense, BRESSON takes a phenomenological dictum, if you are interested in this, that I think is really similar to what Merleau-Ponty said in The Visible and Invisible. Being is what needs creation in order for us to have an experience of it. We need to create to experience the truth of real, we could say. Or when he denounced in his phenomenological perception as the perceptive habits of natural attitude prevent us from having a true access to the being of things in their constitutive otherness. That's a long, maybe I will put out later, but it's too long to comment now. I also like the notion of the reality that has Paul Valéry in his in an article when he said, any view of things that is not strange is false. If something is real, it can only lose its reality by becoming familiar. So the truth of the real is the strangeness of the real. That's the truth of it. So, a naive realistic conception in which the camera was sovereign over capturing what is real will not necessarily take this truth into account. The element of creation is therefore necessary for the phenomenological reconstruction of our experience with the world. The same dialectics involves the term of nature. Since this empirical natural, with difference between the natural, as we mentioned, and the nature, since this empirical natural requires reconstruction, again, to be experienced, this is how we can understand the paradoxical aphorisms that I always find too interesting. That is, it will not be ridiculous to say to your models, I'm inventing you as you are. It's kind of paradoxical statement. This being is the truth of the models, but it's also understood as their nature, in capital letters, in the sense that we mentioned before, as the substantial principle of the model, their essence. As we pointed out, this effect of truth is not linked to a subjective expression. It's not BRESSON who is expressing his subjective feelings, but to make reality take on a new expressiveness in the face of its anesthesia in everyday experience. That's why we say to create is not to deform or invent personal things. We're not creating anything. This is to tie new relationships between persons and things which are and as they are in their reality. That's the point. We're not creating anything. We are making new relationships in the reality as the reality is. Or this quote that is not really comment in any place, but I really like it when he's talk about Montesquieu. That Montesquieu said about humor that its difficulty consists in making you find in a thing a new feeling, which nevertheless comes from the thing. It's the thing that is expressing itself. It's not BRESSON. It's the thing that is expressing itself. That's an interesting thing. So, between natural and nature, and this is, I don't know what happened. Well, okay. Between natural and nature, between real and truth, we therefore find another tension. And we were talking about yesterday about the tension between transcendental feelings of a religious filmmaker, something spiritual, or BRESSON more as a material, a sensorial filmmaker. This is really common in the readings of BRESSON. No? But I think this this tension between natural and natural is self-explaining in, as I'm going to say it now. Natural or real can be identified with that which is purely like external, simple, and without any reason for being beyond its pure presence. Something which can be deduced from aphorisms such as model, two mobile eyes in a mobile head, itself on a mobile body. Stephen Shapiro talked about the literalism of the body. The body is just the body, just that. It's not a transcendental medium for something, just the body. And in this aphorism, we could find this. Or see your film as a combination of lights and of volumes in movement apart from what it represents and signifies. That is the literalism, the tautological self autonomy of the body, besides the meaning, besides the transcendence, besides the spirituality. However, this tension is in the same notes. BRESSON points out that despite this absolute exteriority and simplicity of the objects, the thing that matters is not what they show me, but what they hide from me. We mentioned this aphorism yesterday. In this sense, what they hide can be understood as what they are, but that they cannot show in the mere appearance. Or, here, life cannot be rendered by photographic recopying of life, but by the secret laws, the nature, in capital letters, in the midst of which one can feel your mother's moving, the natural. So, these secret laws are the truth or nature to which we are referring, which can be understood, therefore, as the invisible, and we are going to mention now that of that which is visible, the truth of that real or the nature of that natural. In short, the thing is, it's in its sheer simplicity points to something that transcends it, but it must be from itself that it points to it. This tension is not other than the tension between nature, understood as a mere thing, the natural, and nature as an essence. In the same way as the tension between the real as pure superficial exteriority in the sense of photographic, and the truth as that which gives meaning to that which is real. The invisible of the visible, in this sense, Merleau-Ponty will point out. This tension inherent in the Bressonian theory is therefore to show the second through the first, nature through the natural, truth through the real. But it's not just beside them, but through them, because it's the natural and the real itself who are expressing their nature and their truth, as I mentioned before. As he pointed out on A Manscape, I was hoping that this is a Bresson quote in an interview of A Manscape. I was hoping to make a film about objects which would at the same time have a soul. That is to say, to reach the latter through the former. And this intertwinement is really important. Now, what exactly does that truth or that nature consist of? We have indicated that both appeal to the being of the thing, but nevertheless, this being must manifest itself in its inherent resistance when faced with its materiality. The truth, in order to be true, must therefore express this resistance between the two elements, between this visible of the real, of the natural, and the invisible of the nature of the truth. There is a tension, always. Merleau-Ponty expresses perfectly in the visible and invisible through a similar dialectics with the concept of sensible ideas. And I think most of my argument is resolved in this quote, so I'm going to read it in full, if you don't mind. This invisible reality, these ideas, he's talking about the ideas of music, the ideas of art in this section, cannot be detached like the others from sensible appearances and set themselves up as positivity of the second degree. The musical idea, the literary idea, the dialectics of love, and also the articulation of light speak to us. They have their logic, their coherence, their coincidence, and here too, appearances are like disguises of forces and unknown laws. We were talking about that before. You remember? It's really similar to what he mentioned before that I don't know where I put it, but here. The secret laws in the midst of which one can feel your mother's moving. This is a Bresson statement that is really similar to that. disguises of force and unknown laws. It's really similar. Quite simply, the secret in which they dwell and from which literary expression plucks them seems to be their own mode of expression, of existence, sorry. That is to say, the existence of the musical idea is its own resistant to express completely, we could say. These truths are not only hidden as a physical reality that we did not know how to discover, as an invisible fact that one day we will be able to see face to face, and that other better place could see right now if the screen that masks them was removed. Here, on the contrary, there is no vision without a screen. The ideas of which we speak will not be better known if we do not have a body or sensitivity. Precisely, then they will be inaccessible to us. So this tension between this immanence of the model that is just natural, that is just there, is a pure object, and this transcendence that is the idea, the truth, the nature of it is constitutive. It's not just a dialectics, it's constitutive of the thing, it's constitutive of the experience of it, the strangeness that we were talking with Paul Valéry before. And I really like this also a known quote from him, that forms that resembles ideas treat them as actual ideas. Ideas in this sense, ideas in the sense of sensible ideas of the world, of the material world. So, the Coolidge effect, for example, although it operates in a similar way when it comes to making expressive objects that initially do not have an intrinsic expressiveness, does so at the expense of eliminating all invisibility of their own and reducing faces to a paraphrasable psychological sense. We were talking about psychology yesterday also. The construction of the Bressonian montage must not operate in the manner of the conjunction of images to attain a spiritual meaning. Rather, it must operate in the construction of attention for the opening of the sense of individuality of both images. The question is therefore not to introduce a meaning to the neutral images, but to give them an attempt or an air of meaning, an air of truth. We were talking about that yesterday. We can link it perhaps, and I await suggestion to this regard, like the Alexeian header we were talking yesterday. That is the unveiling as the manifestation of revealing itself without revealing anything specific, but I'm not going to go through that, but maybe it's too dense. I would love to make an actual, precise, a concrete example of what I'm talking about. If you could put the donkey, not already, but yeah, put it, but yeah. Sorry. There but not there, that's it. The donkey belongs to a constant, in our Salvatore, the donkey belongs to a constant tension in the station between being a mere object, a packed donkey that is carried from one place to another, as money will later be a luxury. Only that at exceptional moments, the staging will be linked to the donkey face as gaze, through music or editing, and therefore it will build it a hint of interiority without psychologically reducing the reason for it. It's just a gaze. But we don't know what is he thinking. We don't know what is happening there. It's an air of interiority, an air of inner life, but we don't know which inner life. That's the truth of the thing. This kind of tension between something that is just an object, but at the same time it has a gaze. This tension is the one I'm talking about. And this thing, I think it's pretty, it's pretty clear. Here, the donkey is just an obstacle between between Gerard and Marie, but also the music and the image gives a hint of interiority. So it's this tension between a mere object and a gaze at the same time. So that's, I think, is the matter of the model in a really intrinsic way, I think. Also, we could think about we could think also the perfect sample will be. I don't have much time now. Okay. Okay, I will end like soon, and maybe later we could talk about other things, but I don't have time now. Also, we could think about the example of the donkey looking at other donkeys. This kind of is an air of meaning. There is something happening there, but we don't know what it is. So that's the tension. The truth is this. The truth is the sense of strangeness in the model, the sense of something that is beyond my understanding, but however, it could be understood. We think that we could understand what is happening there, but we don't know exactly what. That's the truth. That's the air of truth, the phenomenological feeling of truth. That's what Bresson is trying to do, I think, we could discuss that. But yeah, I said that it simply retains, and therefore because an individuation center, a virtuality of understanding. Balthasar, again, pure immanence and pure transcendence at the same time. So I will end with this. I'm sorry for the delay. I will end with this last thing. Nature and natural have, however, a sustained kinship, and it's precisely the semiotic opening with which rudimentary materials, without a clear, specific meaning, and only located in a certain constellation of meaning, are inflated. I like this quote by Proust when he said, "The most stupid beings, by their gestures, their words, their involuntarily expressed feelings, manifest laws that they do not perceive, but that the artist surprising them." Or distinction again, and that is really similar to, I didn't translate that, but well, it's really similar to a quote by BRESSON. I mean, in Deleuze, in the Proust and Science, he make a whole book on this kind of rudimentary materials that, as they don't want to express something, the artists find a lot of signs, a lot of pregnancy of meaning. And there exists an intoxication afforded by rudimentary natures and substances because they are rich in signs. With the beloved mediocre woman, we return to the origins of humanity, that is, to the moments when science, I know what happened there, when science prevailed over explicit contents and hieroglyphs over letters. This woman communicates nothing to us, but implicitly produces signs that must be deciphered. So I'm going to conclude with this. This natural, this simplicitness of the thing that is the model is essentially, his essence is essentially to be just simple, to express an air of a nature that is not shown, but is felt. That's the point. It's feel in the editing, it's feel in the construction of the film. Something really simple that at the same time has an air or a feeling of something that is appearing there. So, I mean, that simple is the whole point of my presentation, but we could discuss later. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Alfonso. That was terrific. My head was sparking, like sparking lights going the whole time.
I'm sorry.
So many things to grab hold of. Fascinating stuff. Okay, we move on swiftly to Jonathan. We all know Jonathan, but even so, I'm going to still read out his bio because it's very important. He's co-chair of Notes on BRESSON, program director of the MA Screenwriting program here at the University of Manchester. He's a former assistant to Bresson on L'Argent, to work with Madame Bresson in caring for her late husband's legacy. He's a graduate of National Film and Television School, screenwriter and script consultant. He co-wrote a feature debut fiction documentary hybrid of the acclaimed Serbian documentary filmmaker Maja Novakovic. I'm not sure I got that right. It's currently in post, he's told me earlier this morning that he has 2 films from his scripts being made at the same time earlier this year, which is pretty.
For 1 week, 1 week only.
And you also have a first edition of the Notes in Cinematography.
Yeah, several. Yeah. Thank you, Steve. And thank you, Alfonso, for such a bracing philosophical exploration of some of the concepts contained in the Notes on Cinematography. I have to confess, now I feel like a fraud as well. So quotations and concepts from the notes arose on a number of occasions yesterday, and today I'll endeavour to achieve 3 objectives. Let's jump ahead. First, a description of the contents of this slight but influential and clearly wide open to interpretation an influential volume. This is the copy that I've owned actually since the early 1980s. Secondly, I hope to draw out of the collected aphorisms what I take to be a brief outline of Bresson's theory or approach to filmmaking, a theory of filmmaking which he called cinematography, and which he contrasted with conventional cinema or film theatre, in much the same way as he contrasted model with actor. And thirdly, I hope to point out 1 or 2 tensions within that concept of cinematography and to suggest maybe 1 or 2 possible avenues for further research. Bresson was notoriously private and perhaps evasive, as the researchers amongst you will know, and generally discouraged speculation that strayed beyond the confines of his films. As a consequence, and following his death, Madame Bresson's principal focus over the last 20 years or so has been to ensure not only the digitization of all of the films, but also the striking of new celluloid prints, which will last far longer than those digital versions. Along with the digitization of the films, she's also been concerned to release both Une Femme Douce and Four Nights of a Dreamer from the legal issues which have constrained their availability in recent years. But along with the films themselves, the other on the record item, if you will, has always been notes on cinematography, to which one might now add Flammarion's 2013 publication Bresson par Bresson, a series of interviews dated 1943 to 1983, selected and edited by Mylène Bresson and subsequently published in English as Bresson en Bresson by New York Review Books in 2016. And here's evidence of the significance of notes on cinematography. A cupboard at Quai de Bourbon, stuffed full of copies in a wide variety of languages, and for the BDI amongst you, you can also see a very chunky edition on Godard tucked away in their cupboard as well. As to my objective of a description of the contents of Notes on Cinematography, the book was first published by Gallimard in 1975 as Notes sur le cinématographe, and in English translated by Jonathan Griffin in 1977. With typical Bressonian ambiguity, it's been published in English under a variety of titles, including Notes on the Cinematographer, and recently as Notes on the Cinematograph by New York Review Books in 2016 to coincide with the publication of Bresson en Bresson. But my own preference is Notes on Cinematography, the original English title, and I think the title which best captures Bresson's subject and his intentions. Early editions had no introduction, whilst later editions have included an introduction by J.M.G. Leclésio, the 2008 French Nobel laureate for literature, and author of La Grande Vie, a short novella which provided the raw material for a script that Bresson worked on after completing L'Argent, and once Genesis seemed unlikely to be realized, although it's not my intention to discuss Leclésio's introduction today. The book is divided into two sections, 1950 to 1958, and further notes 1960 to 1974. 1959, the year of the release of Pickpocket, presumably he was busy doing other things and so dropped out for a year. The book contains, I think, 449 aphorisms, of which 362, or just over 80%, fall into the 1950 to 1958 category, and just 87, or a little under 20%, fall into the later, but significantly longer period of 1960 to 1974. The number of notes per page varies between editions, but the first page generally contains 5 notes that reflect upon personal resources. I won't read all 5 of the notes, but 3 features are of particular interest, I think. First, personal responsibility and authenticity weave through those 5 aphorisms. Secondly, the faculty of using my resources well diminishes when their number grows, suggests the tight focus that characterizes Bresson's aesthetic and moral universes. And thirdly, not to have the soul of an executant, invention, reinvention on the spot, suggests a preference for spontaneity and improvisation that arises throughout the notes and which might contradict any impression that we have of Bresson's working method as highly controlled and perhaps predetermined. These 5 quite brief aphorisms are then followed by this page. This touches on the important distinction Bresson makes between actors, seeming, and models, being, and also upon a physical or anti-psychological conception of screen performance, movement from the exterior to the interior, both of which inform Bresson's radical contrast between cinematography and cinema. This heading, in capitals and at the center of the page, human models, establishes an approach that then continues throughout the 1950 to 1958 section. Human models, on looks, etc., etc. The use of these headings is a little curious. Whilst human models is followed by several pages of aphorisms that continue to explore the differences between models and actors, and between cinematography and cinema, Bresson shifts focus elsewhere before the next heading, on looks, arises. The aphorisms that then follow the heading on looks very quickly shift focus, whilst on true and false contains just 2 aphorisms before yielding to on music. On music opens with two significant aphorisms, as in no music. This is interesting, of course, because, as you know, in that period, Bresson was still continuing to use non-diegetic movies on his films. Meanwhile, this second aphorism, which I think Steve really exploited and explored yesterday, touches upon Bresson's sophisticated approach to sound, his determination that sound and image should not duplicate one another, and his conviction that sound leads more to the interior than an image does. We might return to the extent to which the notes have been edited in their current published form, and the order perhaps manipulated and language changed. But for now, let's just explore the aphorisms in the 1950 to 1958 section thematically. This is a fairly proximate and rough approach and yields a list a little longer, but really not very different from Bresson's headings. Personal resources and precision, we've already spoken about, and it's a theme that Bresson returns to throughout the book. Models and actors we've begun to discuss, and after the experiences of Les Anges du Péché in 1943 and Les Dames de Bois de Boulogne in 1945, Bresson reconsidered his approach, I think, to screen psychology and performance. We see that reconsidered approach resolving itself both in the great films of the 1950s, Journal de Courrier de Campagne and Condamné à mort, s'est échappé, and Pickpocket, as Bresson turned to non-professional models, and in parallel in the notes of cinematography from the same period. Automatism will return to, along with the camera and tape recorder, image and sound, ellipsis, rhythm and transformation, when outlining a theory of cinematography. And the notes from this period also refer to painting. Importantly, Bresson's initial medium and a constant point of reference, along with the importance of impressions, sensations, spontaneity and improvisation, feelings and emotions. Meanwhile, music is spurned as accompaniment, support or reinforcement in respect of cinematography, but importantly, like painting, provides a model for creative practice and for expression in other important ways. The complex territory of the natural, the real, the true, freedom and their negations has already been explored by Alfonso, and the remaining notes offer general observations, quotations and expressions of ambiguity and paradox, which I think is an important part of Bresson's work. The aphorisms gathered under further notes, 1960 to 1974, a longer period, of course, than 1950 to 58, as I say, number just 87, or about a fifth of the total number of notes. They're fewer in number and perhaps less polemical, suggesting that Bresson had substantially resolved his notion of cinematography, both as a practical working method and theoretically by that stage. And indeed, already in May 1966, in the great Cahiers du Cinéma interview, The Question, with Godard and Delahaye, it's clear that Bresson is already considering the completion and future publication of the notes. In response to Godard's inquiry about professional actors and performance, Bresson says, you can hear his voice, I'm going to finish these notes, that book that I'm just in the midst of writing, and in which I will explain all that. He respected Godard, but what slide am I on? Yeah, not there yet. It may also be worth saying that the May 66 Cahiers du Cinéma interview is probably Bresson's clearest and most encompassing interview. And in fact, I think if you read it, it almost covers everything that's in the notes in cinematography, perhaps reflecting the mutual respect between Bresson and Godard, and indeed Godard's own huge sensitivity to the work of a filmmaker. But it also, I think, reflects my impression that Bresson enjoyed a particularly fruitful, productive and confident period in the mid-60s, including the production of both Au hasard Balthazar and Mouchette within a very short period of time, pretty unique in his career where there was such a long gap between films generally. Perhaps the one specific development during the period of 60 to 74 in the notes is this one. So whilst quite early in the 1950 to 58 section, Bresson noted no music as accompaniment, support or reinforcement, no music at all, he notes towards the end of the 1960 to 74 section, if we think there's any temporal relationship between notes and placement, he says, it's only recently and gradually that I've suppressed the music and have used silence as an element of composition and means to emotion. Must say this or incur dishonesty. You can feel him grinding his teeth. By music, of course, he means non-diegetic music, whilst diegetic music continued to feature in the later films to good effect. One thinks of the music that rhythmically punctuates the tournament sequence in Lancelot du Lac, or the very fine piano playing towards the end of L'Argent. I remember that being shot, and Bresson absolutely delighted in working with Michel Briguet, the older gentleman who plays the piano in that sequence. But this note, of course, also underlines the extent of Bresson's development and the continued refinement of his notion and his practice of cinematography until quite late in his career. The further notes also contain aphorisms that express earlier ideas with particular force and clarity. Ideas around emotion, the primacy of form, automatism, the value of intuition and chance, and crucially the sensibility of the painter generally, and especially Cézanne. Let's now turn briefly to my second objective, outlining a theory of cinematography, drawing on the notes on cinematography. I place theory in inverted commas as this really, it seems to me, is more of a practical working method than a full-blown rigorous theory. First of all, Bresson believed that the camera not only catches what a machine's scrupulous indifference, believed that the camera not only catches with the machine's scrupulous indifference, but also that it catches certain states of soul recognizable by indices which it alone can reveal. And indeed, the final aphorism in the notes on cinematography also deals with this issue. Oh, sadly, I've dropped off the bottom of the slide. I do that in classes, don't I, as well? What is that? Divination. How can one not associate that name with the two sublime machines I use for my work? Camera and tape recorder carry me far away from the intelligence that complicates everything. And elsewhere, prodigious heaven-sent machines. But Bresson was not alone, of course, in thinking that the camera has almost mystical or spiritual religious capacities. Anthony Minghella, for example, a very different filmmaker in most regards, believed there's something about the camera as a window into other people's souls and other people's experiences. And one could find similar statements and sentiments from many other filmmakers, I think. So what particularly influenced or distinguished Bresson's striking view? Well, born in 1901, he lived in the early morning, if not exactly quite the dawn of this new medium. As a painter, perhaps he was familiar with the camera obscura and its capacity for scrupulous indifference that he talks about in the notes. And the final aphorism in the notes that I've just quoted suggests a simultaneous 20th century modernist and a spiritual or Catholic faith in those two sublime machines that were heaven sent. There is then, I think, a unique confluence here, powerfully influencing Bresson's distinctive view of the nature and capacities of the camera and tape recorder, a view which lies at the heart of his thinking about and his practice of cinematography. So, what to point the camera at? Well, first of all, Bresson had nothing against theatre. Let's make that clear. In the interview with Godard and Delahaye, he says, I have an enormous admiration for the great actors. I think that the theatre is marvellous, but let there be no mixing. And it's the case that his bookshelves contain numerous editions of plays. He's very interested in the theatre, and theatrical texts in the theatre. The problem that Bresson perceives is that theatre relies upon the flesh and blood presence of the actor to gain traction with an audience, which of course is not available to cinema. So with the camera capable of catching certain states of soul recognizable by indices which it alone can reveal, the naturalness of a conventional actor's performance predicated on the creation of a character with dramatic intentions is revealed as inauthentic seeming. These first two aphorisms are the first that are concerned with automatism in the notes. In pursuit of an authentic being rather than seeming, Bresson, working from the exterior, seeks to impose automatism on his models, suppressing intentions and drawing on Montaigne's insight that every movement reveals us, to which Bresson adds, but it only reveals us if it is automatic, not commanded, not willed. And further, one must not act either somebody else or oneself. One must not act anybody. And it's true that Bresson struggled with communicating this idea. You see it in many interviews that people interrogate this and don't always quite get it. And this is a fairly typically hand-annotated page from Esteve's generally positive 1962 Robert Bresson in the Cinéma d'Aujourd'hui series. And you see at the bottom he writes, again you can hear his voice, I didn't ask Florence Delay to be Joan of Arc, but to be Florence Delay. Along with a large volume of exasperated exclamation marks at all sorts of points, plus the very harsh blah blah of Antonioni itself. He was a man of strong views. And the imposition, of course, of automatism was a demanding task, and perhaps a flawed one, and we might come back to discuss that. It required numerous takes, perhaps for three reasons. A couple of entries from my diary at the time, just recalling how slow the work was and how many takes were involved and how frustrated the crew often got. So perhaps there are three reasons why there are so many takes. First, Bresson was meticulous and demanding about the framing and photographic quality of every shot. Secondly, the imposition of automatism wasn't going to be achieved in a single take, and perhaps not within 20 or 30 takes. And Sarah, I remember you talking about you trying to create automatism. It might be interesting to hear how you did it and how long it took you, and whether that was in front of the camera or you managed to find ways separately from the expensive business of shooting that you could do that work. And I think thirdly, and importantly, because the camera's capacity to catch certain states of soul, it wasn't always obvious when the camera had done that work. You didn't always recognize those moments. And of course, it wouldn't become obvious until individual images were subsequently juxtaposed, edited together, and the film begins to take on its organic, completed whole. We talked yesterday about gestures and Bresson's distinctive use of sound. I don't want to spend time on mise-en-scène in general terms there. But I think it's fair to say that Bresson sought what one might call an austere verisimilitude, used a single 50mm lens, for example, and sought, well, these notions here, apply myself to insignificant, non-significant images, flatten my images, etc. With those individual insignificant and flattened images often arising from the fragmentation of bodies, actions, and scenes, and often repeating elements, whether animate hands or inanimate doors, for rhythmic value. And similarly for sound. Rhythmic value of a noise of a door opening and shutting, noise of footsteps, etc., for the sake of rhythm, and of course the value of silence, as Steve pointed out yesterday. And all of this because for Bresson, individual images and sounds were not of independent significance or value. As soon as they threatened that, they would be of little use to him. So shooting is not making something definitive, it is making preparations. Making preparations for the process of creating a cinematograph in ways I think that owe more to painting, a combination of lines and of volumes. An image must be transformed by contact with other images, and perhaps drawn from music as well, the omnipotence of rhythms. Nothing is durable but what is caught up in rhythms. So perhaps more of a reference to the ways of working in painting or music, much more than conventional drama, conventional storytelling, which he had little interest in many ways. And it's arguable that perhaps we're invited to respond to Bresson's films in ways that are more akin to painting and no less emotional than to conventional dramatic provocations and conventions. And all of this yields, of course, the famous quotation on 2 Deaths and 3 Births that in some ways is the genesis, to carry on the riffing, of this event, in that it was my personal favorite quotation and the one that Richard and Tamsin sent me. Finally, I'd just like to raise a couple of tensions and avenues for further research. And again, we've touched on this yesterday. Late on in the notes, Bresson quotes Proust on Dostoevsky, but the medium of the events of your film is about as close as Bresson gets to discussing story, narrative, or drama in the notes on cinematography. He is in many ways uninterested in drama and is certainly more concerned with form, where he would place his efforts. At the heart of the cinematographic film are those certain states of soul and the rhythmic and transformative form in which they come to life again, like flowers in water. But as Jeanette noted yesterday, Bresson was pragmatic about expectations and obligations in respect of narrative or drama, being a commercially viable filmmaker. So generally, he'd freely adapt existing material. He had no interest in making stories up if there was a bunch of stuff on the shelf. But of course, there's a consistency of tone and worldview in the sources that he was drawn to. And that inclines us to interpret the medium of the events of your film as a major determinant of what we think of as the meaning of these films. There's something paradoxical there, which I don't understand, and as you know, be interesting to discuss. Secondly, if there is a theory of cinematography, why is Bresson the only person who successfully employed it? Again, I think this may be a matter of personal circumstance and temperament. Born in the early years of narrative cinema, a patrician, classically educated, Catholic modernist who'd been a prisoner of war, was clearly uniquely formed. Which is why, for me, cinematography is less a theory and more a way of working, a set of specific working practices, full of paradox and ambiguity, justified by the creative outcomes. And we'll look at his influence on some other filmmakers later today, but where influence perhaps is more fruitful than mimicry. And in the same way that we've moved beyond transcendence in this conference, it's also really exciting to see the filmmakers being offered as those influenced by Bresson are not the usual suspects. Well, I was saying to Richard, who's going to talk about Bresson's influence on Alan Clarke. I couldn't see it at all for a moment this morning until somebody says, well, what about this? What about that? You think, oh, God, it's a no-brainer. But we'll see, Richard. It's so interesting. So it's great to see that exploration is going on now in respect of other filmmakers. Moving on, who are the notes for? Well, I presume Bresson initially wrote them for himself as he thought about his work. And clearly, though, by the mid-1960s, at the time of the Cahiers du Cinema interview, he was considering publishing them. And are they offered in the order in which they arose? I suspect not. There are organizing patterns that weave through the book. And I think there are suggestions of changes of language. I think it arose yesterday that models was not the original usage that he offered, although, of course, it's a usage taken from a language he'd have been very familiar with around painting. And there's clearly, I think, been some editing of some of the notes. And am I on my right slide? And what are the influences for the notes? Well, Pascal's pensées seems to be obvious, but there may be more. Pascal's pensées, both because they are aphoristic, although the aphorisms are much longer, and also because they give a distinctively zesty defense of Christianity that I'm sure would have appealed to Bresson. So I think the pensées is certainly one source. And in the Cahiers du Cinema interview, Godard pushes Bresson. There are two you can see this, you know, the battle. There are two tendencies in you. You are, on the one hand, a humanist. On the other hand, an inquisitor. Not in the sense of the Gestapo, of course. Let us say particularly Jansenist. Pascal is an inquisitor, and to me, if there is a film that is Pascalian, it is indeed Balthazar. To which Bresson replies, not really answering the question, well, you know, to my mind, Pascal is so great, but he's great to everyone. Oh. Okay, to finish, I've got a little hand grenade. I don't think I ever discussed this with him again, but this is from my diary of working on L'Argent on the 4th of August, 1982. And in the afternoons, in the middle of the afternoons, Bresson and I would often have a glass of water. He likes to talk English. In the middle of, at some point in the day, we'd go and have a chat. And on this day, he talked of hoping to complete his longer prose version of the notes. Now, I don't know if that's a conversation he's had with anyone else or anyone knows about that. I never picked it up again, but there's perhaps another avenue for research that we might contemplate. So thank you.
Yeah. I have a question for Alfonso. So you talked about this tension between the in itself and the creation by the cinematography. So the gaze, as you call it, right? So isn't this in every film? So for example, acting is considered to be part of the actors, but I could say it's part of the cinematography. I can give you an extreme example of this case, a famous example, like Akira Kurosawa's Throne of Blood, where the acting is so exaggerated that influenced Andrzej Żuławski in his so-called maximalist style, where the acting is no longer, all the actings in Żuławski films are no longer part of the actors. It's what Żuławski wants them to act. It becomes part of the cinematography, the gaze. Do you see my point? So the in itself still is there, but in another form. But this is an extreme example opposite of Bresson. So that's pretty much in every film, I would say, the tension between the in itself, as you call it, and the gaze on the other side. So the question would be why Bresson's film achieves that so-called immanence and transcendence. I'm not sure if it's in what you were saying. Do you see what I'm trying to say?
I think that the example you're saying, maybe it's the same sample of Kuleshov, maybe. It's just something that is just an image, and the cinematography gives it a gaze. in a way, no? It would be something like similar, or it's not the same?
I'm saying, like, if Bresson wants the actors not to act,
Yeah.
because that kind of the in itself comes out
Yeah.
more the model thing. Yeah. So I'm saying, like, in an extreme example of the Zhuavsky films, the acting is no longer part of the actors because he wants all those actors to act in this exaggerated, hysterical way. So it's famous in all of his actresses, like Isabella Adjani or whatever. So they're almost not unrecognizable, Isabella Adjani or whoever it was, the Polish actor. So it's becomes part of the other side, the gaze, the cinematography. So the in itself is still there, even though you have this exaggerated acting. Do you see what I'm saying? So
I should see the film to
Kurosawa's,
yeah, no, I mean it.
no, like
To see the
Rashomon.
point.
Have you
just to
seen
see the point.
Rashomon, for example?
Sorry?
Kurosawa's Rashomon, for example.
Yeah.
The acting is there. The people when watching it in the 1950s, the Westerners, they were like, "What is this acting? It's like not real acting.
Yeah.
It's not real acting." You see the point? It
Yeah.
goes on the other side, the gaze. So the acting was just bizarre to them. It was very. Like, the Toshiro Mifune was going boo like this, like it's like
Yeah.
so you see what Bresson was saying. It doesn't make sense to me. I always thought notes on cinematography was a bit gibberish. So yeah. Like philosophically gibberish. I mean, I liked it as how his thinking was, but I don't take it seriously. So it's like
You don't take seriously who, Bresson?
as a theory, the notes on cinematograph. So because that's in every film what he's saying to me. It's like yeah. But
It depends of the
example. I think makes the point. The acting is no longer part of the actor; it's part of
the editing. You
Brian
say.
De Palma films. The actings are also not real. So it's like, what do you mean? You see what I mean by?
Well, it's not about being real or not. I don't think.
Yeah, but
Like, he wants it to be real in a way, but it depends of the concept of the real you have. It depends of that.
The truth of the person to come out, Bresson.
Yeah, but what's the meaning of truth you're talking about?
Yeah, but I could say the Zhuavsky also wants the truth of the person to come out because that's why he has such an exaggerated acting. I could easily change it for that, so it's.
It will change the concept of truth then.
Yeah, it will be because there's different styles.
So it will change everything.
But I'm saying the tension between the in itself.
About the material and the, you mean?
In every film.
I don't think so.
Cinema history, so it's like.
I don't think so. In the case of I know I should see the film maybe and we'll discuss in a more slowly way, but I think that Bresson is trying just to get a really, well, I don't know if Kurosawa is, you mentioned another filmmaker maybe?
Zhuavsky, Andrzej Zhuavsky.
Andrzej Zhuavsky, the Polish, okay. I think he's trying to do another thing completely. I mean, this kind of completely lack of intentionality, of complete, like a matter of a rock or a tree or something that is don't want to express anything, but expressing something despite itself and despite the film, because it's not just the editing that is expressing the thing in a way that, okay, like the Kuleshov effect, like, okay, we put the two images and the meaning is what the cinematography wants it to mean. We are not talking about that. We're talking about giving something the air of a meaning, even if it doesn't have a specific meaning. That's what I mean by gaze, an air of gaze, not a specific gaze. That's an opening, like in the Heideggerian sense, like something is opening, like not, okay, Kuleshov, I don't know if I'm expressing myself well here, but okay, if we're talking, of course, I mean, which you study that in everything, in every film school. I mean, if you put that image there, it not depends of the expression of the acting of the actor, but the image becomes expressive besides the acting of the actor. No, that's the Kuleshov effect. No, but this has a psychological or a diegetic or even conceptual pursuit. But I don't think that the concept of truth that Bresson is working on is that. I think it's it's more about the resistance of the thing. When he's talking about the air of truth, it's about the resistance of something to mean anything. And I don't find that in Kurosawa at all. This resistance of meaning. That's my point of truth.
Yeah, I think
I mean, we will talk. I mean, maybe you have a point. We will be talking about that. I don't want to diminish your. I'm sorry for.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, Oh, sure. Jonathan, I'm curious to know why you prefer the title Notes in Cinematography to Cinematograph or Cinematographer.
My French is not perfect, but it seems to me that cinematographic suggests an object. The cinematographer suggests the individual. Cinematography seems to be more embracing to me. But that's the reason. I'm not sure it's terribly rigorous, but that's in translation. And Sally's about to tell me I'm mistranslating or missing something in translation.
Well,
But
I actually wrote a footnote on that in my, I think, 2016 article on the early years of Bresson, when the New York Review of Books brought out their edition of it and preferred to put notes on the cinematograph. In choosing the word le cinématographe, Bresson is, of course, taking us back to Lumière. And right, I mean, the Lumiere's invention was called le cinématographe. My problem with cinematography is that it links Bresson's distinction between cinema and what he was doing with just the art of the director of photography.
oh, well, I take it. I agree that's a risk. I mean, the other defence of my position is, of course, Bresson worked with Jonathan Griffin on the translation.
Right.
I think, and Bresson spoke pretty good English.
Yes.
Good English.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty sure that's the original
Intention.
intention.
Right.
This business of translation is interesting. I was thinking about the previous question. Is there something about, because you were talking really about films that probably weren't in your first language about this previous debate. Perhaps one of the reasons Bresson is not huge in France is that maybe that these films look a little ridiculous in French. To us, they look rather magical and other. And I say that as someone who made a somewhat Bressonian film in English, and it looked ridiculous. Bresson said to me it was a nice comedy. Wasn't my intention. So I wonder if there's something around accessing work in different language and in different traditions. But that's just to go back to the previous question.
In Notes on Bresson, there's an interview from Four Nights a Dreamer where he says that previously he had to do, many takes, upwards of 100 takes in Pickpocket, but by the time of making that film, he only had to do 1 or 2 takes because the actors knew what to expect from him as a director. I know that's a very kind of loose and gentle film in his oeuvre relative to La Gente, but I was just wondering what your thoughts were about that, whether they are, they're not being conditioned or emptied, they're playing the hits, as it were,
Interesting.
and why he went back to doing more takes by the time of La Gente.
I haven't read that. I'm not aware of it. I'm very surprised. I mean, certainly on the films before and afterwards, he was certainly doing an awful lot of takes. So I'm surprised. There is something light about Four Nights of a Dreamer, isn't there? For sure. So maybe there's something in that. What did you say, that they knew what they wanted?
He said
as soon as they know something.
Yeah, he said the actors knew what to expect of him. Or no, I think the actors knew what he expected of them. Sorry, yeah.
I mean, I would also slightly requote Jeanette yesterday, which is auteur's lie.
Yeah, of course.
I suspect, one of his other assistants, Muni Kabir, I know quite well. I can check that. I'm pretty sure they were out for very long nights shooting that film.
But doesn't the Jonathan Rosenbaum piece about that they'll talk about lots of takes?
Yeah, I think Rosenbaum was an extra on it, wasn't he? Yes, I think you're right. I do remember that. So,
Okay, yeah, of course.
he was certainly mischievous and capable of reinventing. I mean, it's a surprise if it was truthful.
Not too unrelated. By the way, Ali, I totally get your point. I think it's fascinating. I'm really, it's wonderful to know that you watched him work, and I'm hugely interested in that. When you say that he did all these takes and then you only really knew when it was in the cut, is it not true that he would have known? He would have, even if later he finds it doesn't fit exactly as he assumed, as he was directing, as he was watching the performance, surely he would have known exactly what and where and when something was working. You saw it, you can answer that.
Well, half answer it. Depends what you mean by working. So I think if there are three reasons for lots of takes, one of them was it should be photographically perfect. And it's worth saying, of course, this was in an era of putting expensive 35mm negative in a camera rather than digital photography. So there weren't monitors. You had to select select takes to print. So he might do 40 takes and we might print, let's say 10 or 15. Although people think that all the Bresson frames are kind of locked off. Even when they're locked off, the choreography is very complex. And actually in L'Argent, a lot of moving cameras. So firstly, there was a lot of technical imperfection. So we'd go again for that. Secondly, there's the business of a kind of automatism. Although against that, one of my most striking memories in L'Argent is when the bourgeois woman takes the money to the photographic shop, or maybe it's after, the guy who owns that shop says "imbécile, idiot," with a very specific intonation, which is, I mean, you can obviously make someone say that without intention if you make them do that enough times. Bresson absolutely beasted that guy for an entire afternoon redoing that stuff. So there's the business of automatism, and then I think if you take seriously the notion of what he's looking for, the camera is seeing something, even if it's in not hands, but in that wonderful moment when Yvonne first comes to the photographic shop, and we have frames like from Lancelot, his midriff. Even if a man in a boiler suit, we're looking for something of the interior. I think there's a sense if Bresson was serious about cinematography, there's a sense in which you don't know until you start to look, and also until you interrogate that. And of course, it's all so much about the relationship of one image to another. So there will be selected takes, and there must have been an intermediate process that I didn't quite see. So in the evenings, we go and see the rushes. Bresson and Jean-François Naudin and Naudin's assistant would sit at the front we'd always see them on a big screen, and we'd all sit at the back quietly, and we'd screen what Naudin had been cutting, and then we'd watch all the rushes, and they would whisper away, and clearly there'd be a discussion about which of these two or three you'd try in putting together the next day's work. Was that an answer, Sally? Sorry, I've rambled. Push me if I didn't answer.
Yeah, okay.
No, it's just the fact that as an editor, my experience was so often the case that you would choose the perfect take of a shot, you would then juxtapose it before and after,
Yes.
and realize that another take was actually preferable, even though it wasn't in itself as perfect, which it never is, of course.
Yes.
So that process, which is very, very important in this whole question of the meaning coming out of juxtaposition.
Yes. Interestingly, I don't remember a lot of that. I mean, once takes had been selected and scenes and then sequences were being cut, I don't remember a lot of, oh, that shot doesn't really work. Didn't we do something better? So there was clearly a process between Naudin and Bresson, presumably at the front of that screening room each evening, in which they worked out which they were going to do. And then it may have been that there were conversations subsequently, if it doesn't quite work, can you try another one? But that wasn't something that we as a group were privy to. It was really, Bresson and Naudin sat at the front and they had a separate conversation.
Yeah, I'm very aware of that process, and it obviously exists with all, to a lesser or greater extent, with all,
Yes.
with all film process.
Yeah.
But it's much more to do with, I think there is a sense of recognizing, of knowledge when you watch a performance and you go, yes, and then it drops out, and then yes. And I can't for a moment believe that Bresson didn't have that. Of course, you wouldn't necessarily, people around him wouldn't necessarily know, but I am sure in my heart that he would have known absolutely when it worked and when it didn't.
Yeah, but that's possibly true. I mean, yes, yeah. I mean, certainly would do 20 or 30 takes, sometimes more, and it wasn't. And again, you'll know this isn't a contradiction. Very often, it might be take 10 in the end, which turns out to be the right one. So in that sense, I suspect until he looked at it on a big screen, it wasn't clear that 10 was the best one. And maybe he's still looking for something, but then realizes it had been there all along. Certainly wasn't always the last take, which we got it. Yeah.
Got time for one more question, maybe?
One of the sources of possible information that is sort of inaccessible now are the transcripts of press conferences that Bresson had after the screenings of his films at different festivals. I know Cannes has an archive of such interviews or press conferences. What I'm wondering is if someone had the energy and the time to force the archives to tell us what it is that they have and what's screenable, would it be possible to actually see them and hear them? In other words, see the press conferences as they were recorded, or for example, like the press conferences in the 50s, their audio recordings. Would it be possible to access them without a certain person's intervention?
Well, the 1983 one is certainly on YouTube, isn't it? It's sort of painful.
Yeah, that's the one that sort of everyone refers to. But I mean, there would have been stuff from Trial of Joan of Arc or the Venice Festival.
There's a lot of material out there. You might do better in many ways to ask Tamsin and Richard, who are brilliant at discovering stuff online, which I've never quite managed. But I think we now find out there is more out there than we might initially have realized. But I'm not sure that Mylène has control over Cannes copyright press conferences. So I don't think she would be a blockage to that. Personally, but I don't know. It's a legal matter, but I doubt that will be the case.
Well, I think from the point of view of getting another context in which he's saying things that have clear connections with the notes, it would be interesting to compare the various modifications, the various, the way he's saying things, to get a somewhat richer understanding of what actually is written in black and white in the notes.
I reread the 66 interview with Godard and Delay, and I thought you might almost not bother with the notes. You could just read that. It's really close to a fully realized view, and I think the mid 60s was a powerful period for him, and I think Godard was a particularly sensitive and welcome interrogator. You feel it. I mean, we read it, and poor old Delay chips in with questions, the very long questions and you feel the other two brushing him slightly aside. But I think if you haven't, I'm sure you have read it, Ben, but if you haven't, it's worth reading. I know you could read it in both French and English as well. It's a wonderful interview. It's the best I've read.
No, I agree with it. It's a fairly extensive assemblage of what you see in the book, but it just seems to me plausible that there would have been comparable selections from Venice or Cannes in the 50s that you could find traces in what became the notes.
I know I always frustrate you because I'm just not a historian. So I'm sure you could. And if you've got time when you're traveling around Europe next month, call me and let me know where they are. I'm not doing that work.
No.
But yeah, absolutely. I'm sure there's stuff out there.
Okay. All right. You have an announcement before we finish?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
That was a brilliant. Just a very brief announcement. Sarah came up with an excellent idea to save us trekking around. We're now going to screen Sarah's The Donkey Field in here twice over lunch. So we can grab a sandwich and drink and everything. And then in 15 minutes, the film will be on and we're going to loop it over lunch. So you'll have a chance just to come back here. Okay? Thanks.
Great.